The coffee shop on 5th Street buzzed with the usual morning crowd when Sarah Martinez walked through the glass doors at exactly 7:30 m. Her military bearing was unmistakable, even in civilian clothes, the straight posture, alert eyes scanning the room, and measured steps that spoke of years of disciplined training. She had been home from her 3rd deployment for only 6 weeks, but some habits never fade. Sarah chose her usual corner table, back to the wall with a clear view of all entrances. The barista, a young college student named Jake, had grown accustomed to her routine. Black coffee, no sugar, and she always paid with exact change. What Jake didn't know was that Sarah carried more than just loose coins in her jacket pocket. 3 blocks away, Marcus Thompson sat in a stolen sedan, nervously checking his watch. His hands shook slightly as he reviewed the plan one more time with his 2 accomplices. The coffee shop had been their target for weeks. Always busy, lots of cash transactions, and what seemed like easy targets. Marcus had done his homework, or so he thought. He knew about the elderly regulars, the college students with their laptops, and the business people grabbing quick caffeine fixes before work. What Marcus hadn't counted on was the woman in the corner booth who had survived roadside bombs in Afghanistan and hand-to-hand combat training that could disable a man twice her size in seconds. Sarah's tour of duty had ended, but her warrior instincts remained razor-sharp. She noticed the sedan parked across the street with its engine running. She observed how the driver kept looking toward the coffee shop entrance. Small details that most people would miss, but to a trained Marine, they were warning signals as clear as alarm bells. The morning sun cast long shadows through the shop windows as more customers filtered in. A mother with her toddler took the table near the front. An elderly man reading his newspaper sat by the counter. A group of teenagers laughed over their breakfast sandwiches, all of them unaware that their peaceful morning was about to be shattered by 3 desperate men who had no idea they were about to encounter someone who had faced far worse dangers in places where backup was miles away and survival depended entirely on quick thinking and decisive action. Sarah sipped her coffee and watched the sedan. Her training had taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct was now screaming that something was wrong. She reached into her jacket and felt the familiar weight of her concealed carry permit and the Glock 19 she had been licensed to carry since returning home. Military police training had given her expertise with firearms that went far beyond what most civilians ever experienced. The clock on the wall showed 7:45 a.m. when Marcus finally made his decision. He nodded to his accomplices in the back seat, Tony and Derek, both with criminal records but no experience with military-trained opponents. They had chosen what they believed was a soft target in a quiet neighborhood. Their biggest mistake was assuming that a small woman sitting alone would be helpless. As the 3 men exited their vehicle and walked toward the coffee shop entrance, Sarah's mind automatically shifted into tactical mode. She assessed the layout, counted the civilians, identified potential cover positions, and calculated response times for local law enforcement. Years of military training had prepared her for situations exactly like this, though she had hoped never to need those skills on American soil. The door chime announced their entrance, but something in their movement patterns immediately confirmed Sarah's suspicions. They weren't customers. Tony moved to block the door while Derek approached the counter with his hand inside his jacket. Marcus scanned the room, his eyes settling on the cash register where Jake stood frozen, suddenly understanding that his quiet morning shift was about to become something entirely different. What none of the 3 criminals realized was that they had just walked into a tactical situation with someone who had been trained by the United States Marine Corps to handle exactly this type of threat. Sarah remained seated, appearing calm while her mind rapidly formulated a response plan. She had sworn an oath to protect innocent Americans, and that oath didn't end when she took off the uniform. The peaceful coffee shop was about to become a battlefield, and the 3 men who thought they were predators were about to discover they had chosen the wrong prey. Derek's voice cut through the morning chatter like a blade. "Everyone on the ground now." His shout transformed the peaceful coffee shop into a scene of chaos. Customers screamed and dove under tables while Jake's face went white behind the counter. The mother grabbed her toddler and crouched behind a chair, her child beginning to cry. Sarah didn't move from her seat. While everyone else panicked, she remained completely still, her training taking over. In Afghanistan, panic got people killed. Clear thinking and calculated responses saved lives. She watched Derek wave what appeared to be a pistol while Marcus approached the register, demanding Jake open the cash drawer. "I said everyone on the ground," Derek shouted again, this time pointing his weapon directly at the elderly man with the newspaper. The man's hands trembled as he slowly lowered himself to the floor. His morning routine shattered by violence he never imagined would touch his quiet neighborhood. Tony maintained his position by the door, occasionally glancing outside to watch for police while keeping customers from escaping. His inexperience showed in how he kept shifting his weight and constantly looking around. Marcus grabbed handfuls of cash from the register, stuffing bills into a canvas bag while screaming at Jake to move faster. That's when Derek noticed the woman in the corner who hadn't followed his commands. Sarah sat calmly at her table, both hands visible, showing no signs of fear or compliance. Her stillness in the midst of chaos actually made her more noticeable than if she had been screaming like the others. "Hey, you in the corner! I said get down!" Derek approached her table, his weapon now aimed directly at Sarah's chest. What he saw in her eyes should have warned him that he was making a critical error. Instead of fear, he found the cold, calculating gaze of someone who had looked death in the face before and emerged victorious. "You need to calm down," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady and controlled. Her Marine Corps training had taught her de-escalation techniques, but she was also prepared for the alternative. Derek interpreted her calmness as defiance rather than the tactical assessment it actually was. "Lady, are you crazy?"
"I've got a gun pointed at you."
Derek's voice cracked slightly. He had expected immediate compliance, not this unsettling calm from a woman who should have been terrified. Marcus looked up from the cash register, annoyed that Derek was wasting time on one stubborn customer. Sarah slowly stood up, her movements deliberate and controlled. "I can see that you have a weapon. What I need you to understand is that robbing this coffee shop is not going to end the way you think it will." Her voice carried an authority that came from years of commanding respect in life or death situations. Derek stepped closer, bringing the barrel of his gun within arm's reach of Sarah. It was exactly what she had been waiting for. Military combat training had taught her that the most dangerous distance between an armed opponent and herself was not across a room, but within arm's reach where her hand-to-hand combat skills could neutralize a weapon before the holder could react. "Shut up and get on the ground before I put a bullet in your head." Derek's hand shook slightly as his adrenaline spiked. What he didn't realize was that Sarah's adrenaline was also flowing, but hers was channeled through years of training that had prepared her for exactly this moment. Marcus finished emptying the register and moved toward the customers, demanding they empty their wallets and purse contents. The elderly man fumbled with his wallet while the mother clutched her child and tried to reach her purse with one hand. Tony remained by the door, growing more nervous as he realized this was taking longer than planned. Sarah looked directly into Derek's eyes and spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had survived multiple combat deployments. "You have about 30 seconds to reconsider your choices before this situation changes dramatically. I'm giving you an opportunity to walk away." Derek laughed, but there was uncertainty in the sound. Something about this woman's absolute lack of fear was beginning to unnerve him. He had robbed convenience stores and gas stations before, but he had never encountered someone who responded to a gun pointed at their head with what seemed like boredom. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Derek pressed the barrel of his gun against Sarah's forehead, making what would prove to be the biggest mistake of his criminal career. "I'll show you what happens to heroes." Sarah smiled slightly, and for the first time since entering the coffee shop, Derek felt a chill of genuine fear. He was looking into the eyes of someone who had faced Taliban fighters and survived rocket attacks. Someone who had been trained by the finest military in the world to neutralize threats exactly like him. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, "for bringing your weapon within my reach." In that moment, Derek realized he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. He was not dealing with a helpless civilian. He was facing a United States Marine who had been trained to kill with her bare hands and who carried legal authority to use deadly force in defense of innocent lives. The gun pressed against her forehead was about to become his worst nightmare, rather than his instrument of control. Sarah's response was faster than Derek could process. Her left hand shot up in a sharp arc, striking his wrist with precision that came from countless hours of combat training. The gun flew from his grip before he could pull the trigger, clattering across the tile floor toward the counter where Jake stood frozen in shock. Derek's scream of pain was cut short as Sarah's right hand drove into his solar plexus, with enough force to double him over. Her military hand-to-hand combat training had taught her to disable opponents quickly and efficiently. No wasted motion, no hesitation, just decisive action that neutralized threats before they could recover. Marcus spun around at the sound of Derek's cry, his eyes widening as he saw his accomplice crumpled on the floor gasping for air. The canvas bag of stolen cash fell from his hands as he reached for his own weapon, but Sarah was already moving. Her tactical awareness, honed through multiple combat deployments, allowed her to track all three threats simultaneously while engaging the immediate danger. Tony. "Help him!" Marcus shouted toward the door, but Tony was paralyzed by the sudden reversal of their carefully planned robbery. They had expected terrified compliance, not a counterattack from someone who moved with the fluid precision of a trained warrior. Sarah delivered a swift kick to Derek's knee, dropping him completely to the ground where he wouldn't be getting up anytime soon. The Marine Corps had taught her that neutralizing one threat completely was better than partially disabling multiple opponents. Derek was effectively eliminated from the fight, leaving two remaining criminals who were rapidly losing control of their situation. Marcus finally managed to draw his pistol, but his hands were shaking so badly that his aim was erratic. "Stay back. I'll shoot." His voice cracked with panic as he pointed the weapon in Sarah's general direction while backing toward the counter. "No, you won't," Sarah replied with the calm certainty of someone who had faced enemy fire in Afghanistan. She began moving laterally, using the overturned chairs and tables as cover while closing the distance between herself and Marcus. Her military training had taught her that moving targets were harder to hit, especially for someone whose hands were trembling with fear. The customers huddled on the floor watched in amazement as the woman they had barely noticed transformed into someone entirely different. The elderly man later told police that she moved like she was dancing, but deadly. The mother clutched her child and whispered prayers, grateful that someone was finally fighting back against the men who had terrorized them. Tony abandoned his post by the door and rushed toward Marcus, pulling his own weapon as he moved. Now Sarah faced two armed opponents, but her tactical training had prepared her for situations with multiple hostiles. She reached into her jacket and drew her Glock 19 in one smooth motion, immediately taking a defensive shooting stance. Federal firearms license, concealed carry permit, and United States Marine Corps trained, Sarah announced in a voice that carried absolute authority. "Drop your weapons immediately or I will engage with lethal force." The transformation was complete. The quiet woman who had been sipping coffee moments earlier had become a deadly serious military professional, prepared to use whatever force was necessary to protect innocent civilians. Marcus and Tony found themselves facing someone with combat experience they couldn't match and training they couldn't overcome. Marcus tried to aim his shaking pistol at Sarah, but she was no longer where he expected her to be. Military tactical movement had taught her to never remain stationary when facing armed opponents. She used the coffee shop's layout to her advantage, moving between cover points while maintaining clear shots at both remaining threats. "Lady, you're crazy. There's two of us," Tony shouted, but his voice betrayed his growing panic. What had started as an easy robbery was rapidly becoming a nightmare scenario where they were outgunned and outmaneuvered by a single opponent who clearly knew exactly what she was doing. Sarah's response was delivered with the cold professionalism of someone who had engaged enemy combatants in actual warfare. "I've faced down Taliban fighters with AK-47s and rocket-propelled grenades. You two amateurs with shaky hands and poor tactical positioning don't concern me." Jake, still behind the counter, had managed to reach the silent alarm button during the chaos. Police dispatch would receive the signal. But Sarah knew from experience that law enforcement response time meant she needed to control this situation herself. The safety of every civilian in the coffee shop depended on her ability to neutralize these threats before they could hurt anyone. Marcus made the critical error of trying to use the elderly man as a human shield, grabbing him by the collar and pressing his gun to the man's head. "Back off or the old guy dies." It was a desperate move that revealed his complete lack of understanding about who he was dealing with. Sarah's expression hardened. During her military service, she had sworn an oath to protect American citizens, and that oath didn't end when she left the battlefield. The tactical situation had just become personal. These criminals had made the mistake of threatening innocent lives in front of someone trained to respond with overwhelming force to protect others. "Wrong choice," Sarah said quietly, and both Marcus and Tony suddenly realized that their situation had just become much worse. Sarah's military training kicked into full tactical mode when Marcus grabbed the elderly man as a human shield. Years of combat experience had taught her that hostage situations required precision, patience, and the ability to take decisive action when the moment presented itself. She had dealt with similar scenarios in Afghanistan where civilians were caught between military forces and enemy combatants. "Release him now, and you might walk out of here alive," Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had made life-and-death decisions under enemy fire. Her Glock remained trained on Marcus, but her peripheral vision tracked Tony's position near the overturned tables where customers still huddled in terror. Marcus pressed his gun harder against the elderly man's temple, his desperation growing as he realized how completely his plan had fallen apart. "I'm serious. Back off or he dies." Sweat beaded on his forehead as he struggled to control both his hostage and his weapon while facing an opponent who showed no signs of backing down. What Marcus couldn't see was Sarah's tactical assessment of the situation. Her Marine Corps training had taught her to identify shooting solutions even in complex hostage scenarios. She noted Marcus's poor grip on his weapon, the way his hands shook, and most importantly, the fact that his position exposed his shoulder and part of his torso, despite using the elderly man as cover. Tony tried to flank Sarah from her left side, moving between the overturned chairs and tables. His inexperience showed in how loudly he moved and how he failed to maintain proper cover while advancing. Sarah heard every footstep and tracked his position without taking her eyes off Marcus and his hostage. "Your friend is about to make a very bad decision," Sarah informed Marcus calmly. "You might want to tell him to stop moving before this gets worse for both of you." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat situations where split-second decisions determined who lived and who died. The elderly man, despite his fear, managed to whisper, "Do what you have to do, miss. Don't worry about me." His courage reminded Sarah of the Afghan civilians who had shown similar bravery when caught between American forces and Taliban fighters. Ordinary people capable of extraordinary courage when faced with evil. Marcus's grip on his hostage loosened slightly as he tried to see what Tony was doing. It was exactly the opening Sarah had been waiting for. Her military marksmanship training had prepared her for shots far more difficult than this, and she had qualified expert with multiple weapon systems during her service. "Last warning," Sarah announced. "Release your hostage and surrender your weapons, or I will neutralize both threats simultaneously." Her tactical training had taught her to always give opponents a final opportunity to surrender before using lethal force, but she was fully prepared to follow through on her threat. Tony made his move, rising from behind an overturned table with his gun aimed at Sarah's position. He had underestimated both her awareness and her reaction speed. Before he could acquire a proper sight picture, Sarah had pivoted and placed 2 round center mass in his chest. Her military training had emphasized shooting to stop threats immediately, not to wound or disable. The sound of gunfire in the enclosed space was deafening, but Sarah's hearing protection training allowed her to maintain full situational awareness. Tony dropped his weapon and collapsed behind the table, no longer a threat to anyone in the coffee shop. Marcus stared in shock at how quickly and efficiently his accomplice had been eliminated. "Your friend is down," Sarah informed Marcus with clinical detachment. "You're alone now, and you're surrounded. Police are already en route. Your only choice is to release your hostage and surrender your weapon." Her voice remained steady despite having just engaged in deadly combat, reflecting years of training that prepared Marines to function effectively in high-stress situations. Marcus's resolve crumbled as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. He had expected to rob a coffee shop full of helpless civilians, not engage in combat with someone who possessed both the training and legal authority to use deadly force. The woman he had dismissed as an easy target had proven to be his worst nightmare. Derek, still writhing on the floor from Sarah's initial assault, moaned in pain and tried to crawl toward the door. His knee was badly damaged from her kick, and his wrist hung at an odd angle from where she had disarmed him. He posed no immediate threat, but Sarah maintained awareness of his position while focusing on the hostage situation. The mother with the toddler had managed to shield her child from seeing most of the violence, but she whispered to Sarah, "Thank you for protecting us." Other customers began to realize that this woman had quite possibly saved all of their lives by responding with force when faced with deadly threats. Jake, still behind the counter, stared at Sarah with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The quiet customer who ordered black coffee every morning had just demonstrated combat skills that seemed to come from a completely different world. He would later tell investigators that she moved and fought like someone from an action movie, except it was real. Sarah kept her weapon trained on Marcus while speaking in the calm, authoritative tone she had used to direct military operations overseas. "You have 10 seconds to make your choice. Release your hostage and drop your weapon, or I will take the shot. My military training gives me the skills to make that shot without harming the civilian you're hiding behind." Marcus looked into Sarah's eyes and saw the same cold determination that had allowed her to survive multiple combat deployments. He was facing someone who had been trained to kill enemy combatants in defense of American interests, and he had just threatened American civilians in front of her. His situation had become hopeless, but his pride and panic were preventing him from making the smart choice. "You can't shoot me without hitting him," Marcus insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. Deep down, he was beginning to suspect that this woman possessed skills far beyond what he could comprehend or counter. The standoff lasted only moments longer before Marcus's nerve finally broke completely. Looking into Sarah's unwavering gaze, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. The absolute confidence of someone who had made impossible shots under far worse conditions. Her steady hands and calm breathing told him everything he needed to know about his chances of survival. Okay, Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "I'm putting the gun down." He slowly moved his weapon away from the elderly man's head, his hands trembling so badly he nearly dropped it. The weight of his complete tactical failure was crushing his remaining resolve. Sarah maintained her shooting stance, tracking Marcus's every movement, while keeping her finger indexed along the trigger guard. Military training had taught her that surrendering opponents could still pose threats until they were completely disarmed and secured. "Place the weapon on the floor and step away from the civilian," she commanded with the same authority she had used to direct troops in combat zones. Marcus complied, setting his pistol on the tile floor and backing away with his hands raised. The elderly man he had been using as a shield stumbled forward, shaking but unharmed. Sarah noticed tears in the man's eyes, not from fear but from gratitude toward someone who had risked her own life to protect him. Everyone remained calm, Sarah announced to the coffee shop. "The threats have been neutralized. Emergency services are en route." Her voice carried the reassuring authority of someone trained to take command in crisis situations. The customers who had been cowering in terror began to slowly emerge from their hiding places. Derek continued writhing on the floor, clutching his damaged knee and wrist. His earlier bravado had evaporated completely, replaced by whimpering pain and the dawning realization that he had attacked someone far more dangerous than he could have imagined. Tony remained motionless behind the overturned table where Sarah's precision shooting had ended his threat. Permanently, the sound of sirens grew, louder as police and emergency medical services responded to Jake's silent alarm. Sarah maintained control of her weapon while moving to secure Marcus's discarded pistol, ensuring no remaining threats could access firearms. Her movements remained fluid and professional, reflecting years of training in securing battlefield objectives. "Ma'am," the elderly man said quietly, approaching Sarah with obvious reverence. "I don't know who you are, but you saved my life." "You saved all our lives." His voice carried the weight of someone who had just witnessed evil, confronted by genuine heroism. Sarah's expression softened slightly as she looked at the civilians she had protected. "I took an oath to defend American citizens. That oath doesn't end when you take off the uniform." Her words reflected the depth of commitment that drove her actions, not seeking glory or recognition, but simply doing what her training and conscience demanded. The mother with the toddler approached cautiously, her child clinging to her leg. "Are you really a soldier?" she asked, still processing what she had witnessed. Sarah nodded. "United States Marine Corps, 3 deployments to Afghanistan." The simple statement carried the weight of years spent in service to her country. Police officers burst through the coffee shop door, weapons drawn and ready to engage active threats. Sarah immediately raised her hands, clearly displaying her concealed carry permit and military identification. "Threats neutralized," she called out. "I'm the licensed carrier who engaged the armed robbery suspects." The lead officer, Sergeant Rodriguez, quickly assessed the scene. He could see the professional manner in which Sarah had controlled the situation and secured the weapons. Her calm demeanor and proper identification procedures told him he was dealing with someone with legitimate training and authority. "How many suspects?" Rodriguez asked while his officers began securing the scene. Sarah provided a clear, concise briefing that impressed the veteran sergeant with its military precision. 3 suspects total. 1 deceased from defensive shooting, 1 injured and disarmed, 1 surrendered and secured. Emergency medical technicians entered behind the police officers, immediately moving to treat Derek's injuries while confirming that Tony was beyond medical assistance. The customers who had been terrorized moments earlier watched in amazement as the quiet woman who had saved them provided professional statements to investigating officers. Jake, still shaken from his ordeal, approached the police sergeant. "Officer, you need to understand. These guys had us all on the ground with guns pointed at our heads. She took them on alone and saved every person in here." His voice carried the awe of someone who had witnessed courage beyond his previous experience. Sergeant Rodriguez nodded, having seen enough evidence to understand what had occurred. "Ma'am, we'll need detailed statements, but from what I can see, you acted in legal defense of yourself and others. Your military service and concealed carry permit give you clear authority to use force in this situation." Sarah holstered her weapon and secured it properly, then began providing the detailed account that would be required for the investigation. Her military training had included legal briefings on rules of engagement and use of force, preparation that now proved invaluable in the civilian legal system. The coffee shop that had been a scene of terror was now secured and safe, thanks to one woman's willingness to put her life on the line for strangers. Marcus sat in handcuffs, staring at Sarah with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. He had learned too late that appearances could be deceiving, and that some people carried invisible strength that emerged when others needed protection most. 3 hours later, Sarah sat in the police station conference room, having completed her detailed statement for the investigating detectives. The incident had been thoroughly documented through witness testimony, security camera footage, and physical evidence. Detective Williams, a 20-year veteran, had rarely seen such a clear-cut case of justified defensive action. "Ms. Martinez," Detective Williams said, reviewing his notes, "I want you to know that your actions today saved multiple lives. The security footage shows these suspects had already assaulted customers and were escalating toward violence when you intervened." His words carried the weight of professional assessment backed by irrefutable evidence. The local news had picked up the story, but Sarah had declined all interview requests. She understood that her actions would generate attention, but her military training had taught her to avoid seeking personal glory for doing what duty required. The focus should remain on the victims who had been protected, not on her role in protecting them. Marcus Thompson sat in a holding cell 3 floors below, facing charges of armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and kidnapping for using the elderly man as a human shield. His criminal record meant he would likely spend decades in prison, assuming he survived long enough to stand trial. Word had spread through the jail population about his encounter with the Marine. Derek Williams was in the hospital under police guard, receiving treatment for his shattered knee and broken wrist. Doctors had informed investigators that his injuries would require multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation. His days of committing violent crimes were effectively over, ended by precise application of non-lethal force from someone trained to disable threats efficiently. Tony Rodriguez would not be going anywhere except the morgue. The medical examiner had confirmed that Sarah's defensive shooting had been immediately fatal, with both rounds striking center mass exactly where military marksmanship training had taught her to aim. His criminal career had ended the moment he chose to threaten innocent civilians in front of a United States Marine. The coffee shop customers had been released after providing statements, but several had asked to speak with Sarah personally. The elderly man, Robert Chen, had insisted on shaking her hand and expressing his gratitude. "Young lady," he had said with tears in his eyes, "you gave me the chance to see my grandchildren again. I will never forget what you did." Jake had returned to work the next day, but admitted to reporters that he would never look at customers the same way again. "You just never know who might be sitting quietly in the corner," he told a local television station. "She looked like any other customer, but when we needed a hero, that's exactly what she turned out to be." The mother with the toddler, Jennifer Walsh, had created a social media post that went viral within hours. To the woman who protected my baby and me today, you are the definition of courage. Thank you for showing my daughter what real heroes look like. The post had been shared thousands of times by people inspired by the story. Sarah drove home that evening to her small apartment across town, her mind processing the day's events with the analytical thoroughness her military training had instilled. She had faced combat before, but using those skills on American soil to protect American civilians felt different somehow, more personal and immediate than distant battlefield engagements. Her phone buzzed with text messages from fellow Marines who had seen the news coverage. "Ora, sister. Proud to serve with warriors like you," read one message from her former squad leader. Another came from her commanding officer. "Once a Marine, always a Marine. You honored the Corps today." The local newspaper's headline the next morning read, "Marine veteran stops armed robbery, saves lives." The article detailed Sarah's service record and the events at the coffee shop, but she was pleased to see that the focus remained on the victims who had been protected rather than glorifying the violence that had been necessary to protect them. District Attorney Patricia Gonzalez held a press conference to announce that no charges would be filed against Sarah, calling her actions a textbook example of justified defensive force used to protect innocent lives. The DA praised Sarah's restraint in using only the minimum force necessary to neutralize each threat. Weeks later, Sarah received a letter from the mayor's office informing her that she would receive the city's highest civilian honor for heroism. She considered declining the award, but her former commanding officer convinced her to accept it on behalf of all veterans who carried their oath to protect Americans beyond their military service. The coffee shop on 5th Street reopened a week after the incident, with increased security measures and a small plaque near Sarah's usual table. It read simply, "In appreciation of those who stand ready to protect others." Jake had suggested the wording, feeling it honored Sarah without turning the location into a tourist attraction. Sarah returned to her morning routine the following Monday, ordering her usual black coffee and taking her corner table. Some customers recognized her and nodded respectfully, but most simply went about their daily business. She preferred it that way, just another citizen going about her life, carrying invisible strength that emerged only when others needed protection. The three men who had chosen the wrong coffee shop had learned too late that evil sometimes encounters good people who are prepared to fight back. Their miscalculation had cost them everything, while the woman they had underestimated simply returned to her quiet life, ready to serve again if duty called.